In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Rouge. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I see the tone of this and I think of that light rouge lipstick. There's definitely a pink tone or undertone with this red. Now, I can't say that this is a tone for me, but that's more me than it is the ink. It performs really well. It's very well behaved. It gives a lot of tone variation by pen, so there is a variety that you can get from this ink. And it frequently shades, which is not very common for reds, and it does it fairly well. The pink lean is very obvious on non-fountain pen friendly paper. Now, on fountain pen friendly paper, as a red, it does have a kind of feminine feel about it. And I like it, though the ink, again, is just not really for me. It is a very good ink, though, but I also tend to lean away from red inks as a preference. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Parker Jotter with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The medium nib gives that kind of very pink leaning red. Now, it has no feather, it has no spread. You can see it does shade fairly decently. We get a bunch of darker spots throughout the writing. So while what I see is a red that's very pink leaning, it still gives that shading and a little kiss of color here and there. The broad nib is much darker than we had with the medium. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. It does offer a little bit of tone variation, a little bit of shading in there, but not so much. When you see I get down to the fourth line, the word addition or sold, out, so, quickly, there's some shading in those words. But for the most part, this is a fairly consistent tone. It's definitely in there as the shading, but it is not drawing your attention. The stub nib is certainly lighter than we had in the broad, maybe just a little bit darker than the medium. We get no feather, no spread. We do get to see some of the shading going on here. It looks very nice. Back to that very feminine in tone, not for being pink leaning, but that it makes me think of that, light red pinkish lipstick that my wife would wear. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. It's amazing. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with A Kaweco Sport with a medium nib. A Kaweco Sport with a broad nib. A Kaweco Sport with a 1.5 stub. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at this medium nib, it doesn't look like it's a red at all. It looks very much like a pink. Now, we do get some very light feathering going on, but the feathering that's going on is absolutely manageable. No spread whatsoever. It doesn't shade, though I will say you do see a couple of dark spots that occur, but no real shading. Still, as a pink on this paper, I think it looks very nice. Looking at the broad nib, it's certainly darker than the medium. You have a hard time telling if this is a faded red or a darker pink. Now, there is a tiny bit of feathering. You see it right on the first line. It's there. It's not distracting. It's not in itself a major problem, but it is present. There's no spread and there's no shading whatsoever. The stub nib is a little bit lighter than what we saw with the medium. Now, we get some of the feathering that we've had with the others. We get a little bit of the spread we've had with some of the others. It's the paper, not the ink here. It is definitely a pink tone in what's going on. I don't think it looks its best here. It's very flat as a pink on this paper. The paper is taking any of the liveliness out of this. Looking at the back of the page, there's a lot of spots that look like they're coming pretty deep, but nothing came through, nothing touched the page underneath, and I do think you could write on the back of this page with no problem. No ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, it is still very much that pink tone that we saw with the last paper. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get some darker spots. Now, the darker spots are much more than we had. I want to say that there actually is some shading. You see it in the top line in, you see it in world. You see it show up, but you really only get sort of the end of words that's a little bit darker, and that's not a very predictable. It's not always there. The broad nib has it leaning towards a very dark pink or perhaps a lighter red. There is a little bit of feathering. There is a little bit of spread. Both of them are completely manageable just by writing a bit lighter. I wish this paper came unlined. Lined paper makes me want to conform in its size, so I always have a bit more trouble with that. We get some shading in that you see some words are definitely lighter than others, and there is certainly some dark spots, so I'm going to say it shades. Looking at the stub nib, we're back to the tone that we had with the medium. It's not feathering here. It actually did very well. That squeegee action of the stub really helped it out. We're not getting any spread. We're not really getting, yeah, we are getting tiny bits of shading. If you look at the D in called, you'll see a little bit at the very top. If you look at the word breakdown at the E, at the K, you see a little bit darker. So, yeah, it does shade just a little bit, but not very much. Looking at the back of the page, if you wanted to, you could use the back of this page. I guess I wouldn't. The ghosting's not too much, it's that the ink is getting very heavy into the page, but it never came through and bled onto the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we're still holding on to that very much a pink tone. We get no feather, we get no spread. We do get little bits of shading throughout, but not really very much. I don't think this is going to be an ink you use on a lot of paper that isn't for fountain pen with the hope of shading, because then you are really hoping against hope for it. It doesn't really do it there. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the medium. We get no feather, we get no spread. We do get shading, technically. In the middle of the middle line, you see have, run, and he. You see it's all of that's going to go darker to lighter to darker. So it's definitely there. I just don't know that this is, it's there. It's almost like it's getting, the pen's getting drier and wetter, but it definitely is shading in there. Looking at the stub nib, we're getting about the same tone that we had with the medium. We get no feather, we get no spread. We do get little bits of shading that are going on, especially when you double back over areas in letter, but not all the time. It is present. I find this harder to read than it was in the medium, though, just for some reason. Even though the tone's the same, I find this not what I would want to be writing with. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ghosting, way under control, not a problem for ghosting, and there's no bleed through touching the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Brilliant Red. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Blue number 3. Here is Noodler's Rabble Red. Here is Sailor Fire Red. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we see it's actually a little bit darker as that pink, leaning more towards the red again than we had with some of the other papers. Now, we're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread, we're getting very good performance on this paper. It's really, I think, coming around here. No real shading going on, although I'm going to come back on that and say in the fourth line you see it's a little there, embroilment. I guess it does shade just a little bit. This ink is strong enough to shade even on some of these papers. The broad nib is much darker than we had with the medium. I prefer this tone much more in what we see here. It looks like a lighter red, not as much as a pink. I don't mind pink inks. They just have to be the right tone for me. Now, we're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. We are getting some shading. So this is doing especially well on this paper that doesn't always do well. The stub nib is about the same tone that we had with the medium, and when I said this paper doesn't always do well, it's doing really well here. We get no feather, we get no spread, we are getting shading. This looks good. If you like this pink, this is a great tone of what's going on here, though it's, I believe, supposed to be a red. I could be wrong. Looking at the back of the page, it is clear that the ghosting is way under control. You could certainly use the back of the page if you wanted to, and there is no bleed through touching the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here's a blue-black ink by Pilot, their mixable blue-black. Here is a shimmering gray ink by Diamine, their Moondust. Here is a blue ink by Diamine, their 150th anniversary Tudor Blue. Here is a black ink by Cross Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, we have a pink. That pink does feather. It does spread. Both of them are under control, really. I think the feathering is much worse than the spread. When you see the name Pepisse, very, very feathery. I'm not blaming the guy. I'm blaming the paper. And we're not really getting any shading here, but we're not expecting that with this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it's quite a bit darker than we had with the medium. It feathers, of course. It spreads, of course. Does it shade? No, it does not. We blame the paper, not the ink. People love seeing this paper, so it's going to be that regular part. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the medium. We get feather, yes. Spread, yes. Is it manageable if somebody really wanted to use this ink on this paper? Yes. These are all choices for you. Would I? No. Does it shade with the stub? No, it does not. Looking at the page underneath, you see that nothing bled through, touched the page there, so no problem. And when you see the back of the page, you see a lot of the ink really coming through, but it never did it. You just can't use the back of the page because of the extreme ghosting. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I get a little confused about whether rouge is a red or a dark pink. Regardless, I like its darker tone from a wet, medium, or broad pen. I find it the most pleasant for me on the page, even though I don't typically go for reds. Pinks don't bother me, so the pink undertone, I think it all looks the best with that wetter pen. But a dry pen of any nib will make that feminine tone really come and stand out about this ink. So if that is what you would be interested in, that is a great way to go here. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.